Welcome everybody to AI Diversity and the Future of Hollywood. I imagine that was a title that was nice and provocative for you. I want to take a minute first to introduce the panel who I'm super lucky to be sitting up here with these folks. They're super smart, way smarter than me. I'm excited to have this conversation. Kamala Avila-Salmon is the first head of inclusive content for the Lionsgate Motion Picture Group, where she develops and implements diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies to reflect a globally diverse audience in the studio's film slate. Her mission is to diversify the powerful images and messages disseminated by Hollywood. Evan Shapiro is the official, unofficial cartographer of the media universe. Evan has mapped the tech and entertainment ecosystem, and he charts our industry's future. Previously, he ran IFC, Sundance Channel, Pivot, and CISO, where I sold him a few shows, and oversaw, produced, or co-created many Peabody and Emmy Award-winning TV series. He also has better hair than me, but we won't talk about that. Rebecca Finlay is CEO at Partnership on AI to Benefit People and Society. As head of this global nonprofit, Rebecca brings together an international multi-stakeholder community of over 100 partners in 16 countries to advance positive outcomes for people and society. We'll hopefully have some positive outcomes today. I'm H Schuster. I'm the founder and CEO of HUSSLUP. We're a professional network that connects creative talent in film and TV to each other and to the companies that need to hire them. Our mission is to democratize access to the industry. 70% of our members self-identify as diverse. And I have QR codes if anybody in the audience wants to jump the wait list and join today. So welcome to our panelists and welcome to all of you. I'll set the table a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, and then we'll jump right in. The panel's really looking at the collision of two moments in the entertainment industry. On the one hand, a number of studios are pulling back on the DEI initiatives that have brought more underrepresented voices into the pipeline to create content. And with this reduction in access, we need to ask ourselves, how do we continue to produce inclusive content? And on the other hand, the rise of AI is and will continue to transform the production of content in film and TV. AI has become a major issue, obviously, in the recent industry strikes. You guys may have seen Duncan Crabtree Ireland's panel a few days ago on SAG's approach to these issues. And Tyler Perry even cited the new AI video generator as one of the reasons he shut down his $800 million studio expansion. We'll talk more about that in a little while. If AI is biased, what does that mean if it's being used to create inclusive representations in Hollywood content? We're going to talk about that. This topic is quite vast, and the panel will explore some difficult ethical and legal issues. And we won't answer all of these questions today, but hopefully we'll do our best to put forward a series of valuable questions and areas for everybody to continue to work on actively after the panel. We'll start each answer with one panelist and then open it up to the rest of the panel. And a lot of these topics that we're talking about today really are, to quote Law and Order, ripped from the headlines. So we'll set the table by talking a little bit about the current state of DEI programs in Hollywood. In the June decision, Students for Fair Admissions versus Presidents and Fellows of Harvard College, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down affirmative action in college admissions and really set off some alarm bells for corporate America that they would be the next target of litigation in this area. Shortly after, a number of top DEI executives in the entertainment industry were laid off. Now, it's common for DEI programs to get cut in belt tightening across many industries as sort of a quote-unquote nice to have set of programming, but these two events do seem somewhat linked. Kamala, you and your team have set up an incredible program at Lionsgate that continues to thrive. We're happy about that. Can you tell us a little bit about that program and how you structured it, and maybe more broadly, what's happening with DEI in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Thank you to the audience for being here. So I think first I want to say that, like, a lot of times when things happen sort of in a cluster, there is the tendency to believe that they're all the same thing. They're all happening together. And multiple things can happen in an ecosystem and they can all be somewhat independent. However, so the way that I would think about it is that, you know, both the affirmative action result as well as what we're seeing in Hollywood, those are both symptoms of a broader sort of systemic issue and conversation that we're having, where a lot of the enthusiasm around DEI in 2020 and early 2021 was really coming from what I would characterize as sort of guilt and hand-wringing, right? Which is not an activity that most humans are able to participate in for a long time, right? And so from a cyclical perspective, we have seen this in DEI in corporate America over the last 20 years. It's in, it's out, it's in, it's out, right? The fundamental issue has never changed, which is the discussion was trying to be about how do we create equitable representation and inclusion inside of all industries, one, in an attempt to better serve our audiences, and two, in an attempt to better reflect our actual lived reality. So, you know, throughout the ups and downs, and I know many of the executives that have left, not all of whom were laid off, many of whom left on their own accord because they recognized exactly what we're talking about. You know, real change agents don't want to be involved in performative actions. So I do think that that had a lot to do with it. But for me, I was really intentional about making sure to set up what we were doing at Lionsgate in a way that I thought would be systemically impactful and would be difficult to unravel. So, you know, when you are thinking about a film slate, there are a lot of different decisions that are made along the way that impact what the slate will look like. It's not just sort of like, this is a casting conversation, throw a black person in there, have a lead female, like that's not what I was looking at, right? I was like, explain to me the process for how you get to your slate. The script and creative conversations, the greenlight conversations, the marketing conversations. How do we embed inclusive interventions and inclusive thinking in each one of those so that at every given decision point, we are thinking about how to optimize inclusion in a way that is authentic and is gonna connect with an audience. So I do think that that has been helpful in the longevity of our efforts, as well as, you know, the leadership team that I joined, I was very clear, this is who I am. I'm not a token, I don't know how to do performative things. I try too hard, so they have to be impactful. And that leadership team has remained consistent in that commitment, even though, of course, we are not where we were in 2020 and 2024. The conversations are different, they're harder, but they're just as worthwhile.
That's great, and sort of a follow-up question that starts to move us into the AI conversation. There's been a lot of discussion about studios using AI for script coverage, right? And that AI is now doing the script coverage, used to be assistants doing the script coverage, now it's AI, and assessing whether a project is viable, and potentially even impacting a greenlight decision based on that bot's coverage. Now, bots are obviously trained, they're trained with potentially biased data, potentially biased information. What does it mean to have sort of a bot doing this coverage, and how do we kind of protect for what that means?
I would say there's two types of bias that we have to be aware of when we're talking about AI. One is just human bias, right? You know, AI is going to be as biased as those that have created it. AI has bias because we have bias. We like things that are similar to things we have liked before. We like people that kind of look like us or remind us of ourselves. Like, that is normal, that is natural, and that is something that can run rampant sort of when set to like automate. I think there is a second piece of the bias though, which is historical, right? Like and this is true in greenlighting and human greenlighting, right? We are more likely to greenlight a project that looks like a project that we have made before, that has been successful before. When we look at the history of film and TV, we know whose projects have been made more often than and whose hasn't, right? So if I can name to you 100 films that have been made with this type of a story, with this type of a cast, and it succeeded 57 times, but I can only name to you 5 times this story has been told, it's feeling very risky, right? And so I think that when it comes to introducing AI into these systems, we have to think about it as an enhancement, but not a decision maker, right? It is something that can take some things that we are able to do and maybe help us do it slightly faster, slightly more efficiently, but it's never gonna replace the lived human experience and the collection of perspectives that you should wanna have in the room. Diversity is not just sort of good for business because it helps with like a pretty corporate photo so you can send to your customers, look at who we have. It's because you actually believe that the lived experiences will make the decisions that you're making better. And I don't see how AI would be able to replace that. So I do think that like I'm not as worried about it, but I do think it's something we have to know. Just like when you ask your assistant to cover a script, what are their biases? I think you should be asking the same question.
H, do you mind if I jump in on one thing?
Yeah, please.
I think 2 words that Kamala used are incredibly important when it comes to DEI and sustainability in the media ecosystem. Programs versus systems.
Yeah.
A program gets canceled. It runs out.
Right.
It runs out of funding. Main reason why diversity, equity, and inclusion became really important in 2020 is because a black man was killed in the street by a camera.
Right.
And we all felt awful about it.
Not for the first time, I know.
Right.
Yes.
Well, on camera.
Not for
Not
the
for the
first
first
time.
time.
First time that many of us saw.
All of a sudden, everyone was
But-
like,
but it
is
was-
racism really still happening? Why didn't you tell us?
It was the first time it got circulated so
So
profoundly on social
and it helped
media,
that we were
and
all
so
locked down
just-
at home,
Very much so.
watching
Full
our phones
attention.
24 hours. But until we create systems
Right.
that cannot be unwound,
That's right.
until the incentives, the financial incentives of the companies and the executives at the top of that
That's right.
are wound into the incentives we all have to make ourselves more diverse and more, frankly, well-rounded as a community.
Right.
That's the only way to make sure these things remain permanent. There's another component to this, which is just a pure wave of data that's headed at us. By the end of this, by the end of this half century, the majority of Americans will be something other than white. And so, there is a great financial incentive to create art that looks like that audience.
That's right.
And so,
In
we
fact,
have
it's pivotal to success, to corporate success.
100%. And those who do will be more successful than those who don't. So we have to educate the senior executives. We need a wave of leadership change in the media ecosystem to get rid of the kind of C-suite oligarchy that we've had for the last 35 years, who all look dramatic. Although I will say, people hiring only people who look like themselves is kind of why I'm on this panel, H. So I'm gonna take. But we have to create financial incentives to dissuade executives to continue to hire their nieces and nephews. We have to do away with internships that only go. You work 56 more times.
Unpaid internships. Right?
Unpaid internships to live in New York and Los Angeles. Come on. You have to be rich,
Right.
which means you also have to be probably a bunch of other things. You're 56 times more likely to have gone to an Ivy League school if you work in an SVP or higher executive job at a media company than the average American college student. Not the average American, but the average American college student. So who gets the internships?
Right.
Who get and so if we change the internship program in this country or in the media to give it to people who go to community college and we pay them and we give them living expenses to go along with it, that's a systemic change. If we change the incentives of David Zaslav and Bob Iger and all the rest of them to match the incentives that society has around creating a media that looks like our audience, then we can make change. But until the systems are changed permanently, the programs are going to come and they're going to go based on what happened that week in the news.
That program worked, we don't need to do it anymore. That program didn't work, we shouldn't do it
That's
anymore,
right.
right? There's always a reason to cancel the program.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah,
with,
Rebecca.
Is this working? Yeah. So just want to say, I am definitely the one person who does not understand Hollywood and the media system. You just used the phrase script coverage, and I'm thinking script coverage. What's
It's a
that?
summary.
It's okay, got it. But I just want to say that all of the issues that Hollywood is dealing with regard to DEI and sustainable approaches to fairness and accountability, those are exactly the same the issues that we're dealing with when I think about the AI companies that sit around the tables at the Partnership on AI. So much of that has been really focused on the pipeline, right? So much of the talent is computer science, that is largely white men. That's where so much of the issue has come with regard to concern around bias and discrimination, both in the data sets and in the outputs of those data sets as well. But
Who's turning the knobs, right? Who's training, right, the AI?
Yeah, exactly right. And the fact that we think of it as a technical challenge when we know that technology is political and it's a social and economic and cultural challenge as well. But I think one of the really interesting things that I heard you talking about that I just wanted to lift up from my perspective is that it is about process. Fairness is about processes. You talked about systems as well. And one of the areas that we've looked at is attrition of those workers that come in from historically underrepresented or marginalized groups often don't last as long within the corporate structures as well. And this is crucially important in artificial intelligence because it's really an interdisciplinary field. You have to come with a diversity of perspectives and lived experiences. And so those systems and processes, those changes to leadership are the ways in which we will start to really limit the high rates of attrition that we're seeing also within this
Yeah,
context.
and that lack of stickiness for people who are traditionally underrepresented. This is also true of higher education in the United States. People from traditionally underrepresented communities tend to drop out at a higher rate in college because there's not inclusion. Diversity and inclusion are two different things. You show up, you're the only one in the room who looks like you, and nobody else knows how to talk to you, and you don't feel comfortable. Are you going to stay? Why would you?
I'm going to move on to AI and deepfakes, which sort of takes this to the next level. Obviously, that was a big part of the SAG-AFTRA negotiation because to date, deepfakes really aren't very well regulated. There's no federal law that establishes an individual right to their name, likeness, image, voice, and only about half the states have laws addressing this. This has been a big problem with a lot of things, revenge porn and a lot of other things. We're going to talk about George Carlin. In January, George Carlin's estate filed a lawsuit against a media company that used AI to generate an hour-long new comedy special called George Carlin, I'm Glad I'm Dead. He might actually be after this comedy special, that featured the voice and likeness of George Carlin. And we actually have a little clip of this that we'll play for you.
Thank you. I'd like to start off with a heartfelt apology. I'm sorry it took me so long to come out with new material, but I do have a pretty good excuse. I was dead.
The lawsuit alleges that this company infringed on copyright by using Carlin's materials to train the chatbot that created that voice, which if you know George Carlin, it sounds like George Carlin, without seeking the permission or licensing of the estate. Evan, I'm going to pick on you for this one, mostly because I'm just really curious about what you're going to say. Is copyright law just completely obsolete now, right? I mean, it's been studying with digital media for a long time, but is this just blowing the hole through it so large that...
It's funny, like on one hand, I'm a huge proponent of fair use, right? I believe that, the original copyright written into the Constitution was 14 years. Now it's 75 years past the death of the author, thanks to Disney and Mickey Mouse. Now, Mickey Mouse is starting to come into the public domain and they're being hoisted on their own petard. So I do have two minds of this. On the other hand, no, you should not be able to steal money from the Carlin estate by recreating his mental imagery, right? And lift his sense of humor, although the jokes were not nearly at the same level of George Carlin. And so, no, I don't think copyright, I mean, whether it's, the Partnership for AI or C2PA, there's a couple of different things. There are a number of different kind of new versions of copyright being written around original content. Part of the importance around AI and deepfakes is first making sure that everything that is original content has provenance, has a trackable deed somewhere, that when you see it, you can click on it. I was on a panel yesterday with someone from BBC News Labs, and they're leading a charge with this, along with Adobe and Microsoft and the New York Times, and ad agencies and things like this. So that when you see something, you can click on it and turn over the card and basically say, this was real.
This is where blockchain could come in handy.
It could.
Remember NFTs, anybody, 2 years ago?
3 years ago. Those were the days. So I do think copyright is not dead. I think it's two things. It's being able to prove that what is fake is really important, but I also think that being able to demonstrate that what is real is, if not equally important, I would say probably more important. I would defer to you on this to a certain extent, because I think, who here uses money? How often do you worry if the bill you're using or anything is counterfeit, right? It doesn't come up in our lives all that often. And so, and we've had money for a lot of time. So there are ways to make sure that we can track the provenance of our intellectual property. And I think the more that we pay attention to protecting what is true, what is original, what is authentic, then we have a better system to protect against those things that are not.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about how this frontier of deepfakes affects underrepresented talent, who essentially could be made to say anything with a deepfake, right? So it's one thing to hear George Carlin making jokes about being dead and about some of the social issues that Carlin used to be brilliant at making comments on. But let's imagine it's a Richard Pryor deepfake, and his comedy that the AI bot is generating is not comedic. It's actually just a spew of racial epithets.
I mean, it sounds like Dave Chappelle.
Spicy.
Dave Chappelle's a comedian. That's anti-trans humor.
Supposedly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, again, I think if you want to go back and listen to the classic Pryor albums, you should be able to tell when they are truly Richard and when they are not truly Richard, and you should be able to very easily suss out what is and what is not. To a certain extent, there should be a great way to kind of like hold up a PMS chip against his voice and be able to tell that's his voice, that's not his voice. You know, at the end of the day, the jokes that were written were bad for Carlin. I've yet to see a piece of original content. There are pictures here and there. Kamala showed us a picture earlier today of black people liking Donald Trump. That was clearly not true, but it looked a lot.
It looked very
really
frighteningly
authentic.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think we should be able to. Deepfakes are going to be very difficult, but counterfeits are not new either. And so I think being able to lean into the promise, being able to understand, to dip into the library of Richard Pryor and do a spot check against his jokes that are being written by a bot, to me is one of the things that I think AI can fix. You know, that is, AI is a tool that can help us use AI to a certain extent. It is tech that helps us use the tech. But at the end of the day, you do have to be discriminating yourself. You do have to not do your own research, because I hate that phrase, but I think you do have to make sure that you're one of the greatest problems America has had over the last half century is a lack of media literacy in our schools. And our failure to teach children and adults how to use the media, how to understand, say again?
And civics.
And civics.
And critical thinking.
And critical thinking. Where is this message coming from? Who is sending it? What is their agenda? None of those things have to do with tech. They all have to do with critical thinking. We've lowered the standards of critical thinking in this country so far that we are now more gullible than we have ever been.
Well, that's a good moment for Rebecca, you to tell us about the liars, I'm gonna get it wrong, the liars deficit.
The liar's dividend.
Dividend,
Yeah.
not a deficit, the opposite, a dividend.
It's the liar who wins, in fact. And so this is a commonly used phrase when we think about the creation of deep fakes and the proliferation now of mis- and disinformation campaigns. And the idea is, who wins if we don't trust anything we read? The liar. And if we are moving into a world in which we can't trust our own eyes and we can't trust our own ears, what does that mean in terms of both the responsibility of the citizen? I absolutely agree. But there is a responsibility for our legislators and for ensuring particularly that we protect vulnerable groups like women and children in terms of the use of the media. And there is also a responsibility for the companies that are building that technology, who are deploying the technology, and those creators who are using the technology as well. And that's where the work of the Partnership on AI comes in. And last year, we had done a lot of work on trying to come up with technical ways to find deep fakes. And what we found was it's actually a very hard challenge. And that's when we moved in with Adobe, with the BBC, with New York Times, with Meta and Google to really focus on provenance, exactly as you said. And out of this came the C2PA standard, which was essentially a mechanism whereby you could input in a technical way, input in whenever you altered or changed an image. And this was a way in which when something came into example to the BBC, they could authenticate, okay, this is real.
Kate Middleton's picture.
Or not.
Right.
Yes, right. Real or not. And that was one of the ways in which they could actually validate and trust their news sources. And important to note that yes, they were able to turn to the technology, but they also had institutional mechanisms like just trust in who the person was and the way in which the media came to them. So there's a whole sort of ecosystem of approaches. But we came out with this code of conduct last year, 12 companies, Adobe was there, BBC was there, CBC, and Canadian was there, it was good to see. Also, OpenAI was there in terms of the creation of media, and a number of startups who are developing synthetic media. And the idea is, to come to the George Carlin question, in the first instance, consent. If you are going to use or develop synthetic media based on an individual's identity, you must seek their consent. And that can be challenging, and we can talk about some of the gray zones and areas, but that is one core principle of the code. The other is disclosure. You must disclose if you are using it, and there are really two ways you can do that. One is what we call indirect, so those are all the watermarking, technical hashtags that can appear, and these are mechanisms whereby one organization to another organization can technically show that this is synthetic media and it's been used in some way. And then the other is direct disclosure, and this is what you think of as labeling, right? When you see, for example, the New York Times just had an article about Sora, the new OpenAI, and on each one of the videos that they used, it said AI generated, right? So this can be politicized too, as we remember from previous election campaigns, but the idea being that there has to be these things, they have to work together, and ultimately they have to be transparent about their use. We've got to build a way, both for citizens and for other companies and for activists to understand the quality and variability of the media that's being
And the basic premise is that if all the good actors band together to create provenance around authentic content, to create clarity and transparency around the times they're using artificial intelligence or some other kind of synthetic content generator to create new content, and there's clear labeling on all of it, you surround the bad actors to the point where they become very discernible and very irrelevant at the end of the day.
Well, let's talk about that then. Let's talk about transparency, I think, and the responsibility of the media company, right? Let's talk for a minute about AI being used to create original talent, right? We'll talk specifically about FN Mecca, who was a virtual black rapper. He had 10 million TikTok followers. That motivated Capitol Music Group to sign him to a record deal in 2022. This was going to be the first virtual or AI-generated rapper to have a record deal. Then, after growing backlash to what critics were calling gross stereotypes that amounted to digital blackface, essentially, including content that trivialized incarceration and police brutality, Capitol basically pulled back. They said they severed ties with the FN Mecca project, and they basically issued an apology to the black community. Rebecca, I'm curious, in terms of the kinds of guardrails you're talking about, how do you deal with something like the FN Mecca situation? And I'll just put a visual up of what FN Mecca looks like. Whoops, I may have done that too quickly.
Was created in
That's FN Mecca. I'm curious, is it the audience's responsibility or a watchdog group, like what happened with FN Mecca, to call it out and to police it? Or should Capitol Records have done something like that? Who's responsible here for saying this content is not appropriate?
Yeah, well, I think in the first instance, the corporations do need to be absolutely accountable for any of the content that they are developing. And so, for example, we're going to talk a little bit about the example of Gemini, the Google image generator that was released, and some of the images that they developed, and they pulled it off, right? They took it out of production because they were concerned about it. The OpenAI Sora one that I just mentioned is only in research release, so they're releasing it, but they're iterating through a process of really trying to make it better. So there are all sorts of ways in which companies can actually be much more proactive. Also, just being transparent about what.
But it's not like Capitol Music didn't know what they were buying. They signed this guy, right? I say guy, this AI rapper.
Yeah, I don't think that they knew though. I mean, I think, people, they jump on trends.
Right.
Because the senior suite at most of these companies is completely uneducated about what's actually going on in the world right now. mistake. How did that happen? Well, you didn't have somebody from a diverse community in the room
Yeah.
when you made the fucking
Yeah.
decision in the first place. And have somebody under the age of, oh, I don't know, 35. Because diversity
To
isn't
be
only
35 again,
about
come on.
race and color, creed, and faith, but it is also about age, especially at this moment in time. If you're making decisions in corporate America, especially in corporate media, without people under the age of 30 in the room, you are going to fuck yourself. There is no question about it. And then they jumped on a hot trend because they thought they were going to get something, they were going to catch a tiger by the tail, and then it turned out to bite their head off. Oh my goodness.
Well,
Big
that's what's
surprise.
interesting about the creator's response, right? One of the creators of FN Mecca said about the character, he's a black guy, not this malicious plan of white executives. It's literally no different from managing a human artist, except that it's digital. And then he added that the team behind FN Mecca was, quote, actually one of the most diverse teams you can get. I'm the only white person involved.
Said the spokesperson.
Said the spokesperson. So, Kamala, I know you have some thoughts on this. I'm curious, is it okay if the creators of the AI rapper are black?
No, it changes nothing. I mean, I think for me, this is the corporate example or embodiment of a saying that we have in the black community: loving black culture, but not loving black people, right? This is what that looks like, right? How can I capitalize on something that seems hot in the streets or hot with a certain community without having to actually employ, engage with, elevate, listen to black people, right? I can create an AI black person.
How do I take black people's money without having to talk to any black people?
I mean, they're like, finally, the innovation we needed, right? I mean, here's the thing. I think that like when it comes to things like this, we have to be critically aware of all of the different dynamics, right? So of course, what you were saying, Evan, about sort of representation in the room that matters, but representation does not make a bad idea suddenly good, right? We still have to actually use our own sort of analysis and think about sort of like, what am I actually doing? Because when you think about it in this context, African American creatives are underrepresented in a lot of places. You know one place that they're not underrepresented? In rap music. So the idea that you are like, to create an opportunity for a black artistic voice, I need to AI one. Wait a minute. You can go to the corner of X and Y in any urban city and find a rapper that's 10 times better than that, right? And so if your instinct is to not do that, but to do this, why, right? And I think it is about sort of like trying to be trendy and trying to be cool. And there are a lot of situations where there may be a diverse team that's making decisions, but who is actually in charge? Who actually feels comfortable speaking? There have been many times when I've been brought in, and I know that I'm being brought in to say okay to a decision that they kind of know is bad, but they're hoping they can find one black person that says it's okay, right? I too can find one black person that will tell you almost anything is okay. What if I told you black people don't all agree and are not a monolith, right?
Wait, what?
It's like, wait, I spoke to 3 black people. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. You didn't speak to me, and I don't think this is right. And here's my evidence and my data, right? It's not just my anecdotal opinion. And so I do think that like we have to remember why it is that we think having a diverse creative team is important, or diverse decision-making team is important. It's because of different lived experiences, right? But if we're not giving each of them an equitable seat at the table, if we're not also just looking around and remembering that like the internet wasn't created today, the US wasn't created today, there are historical things we need to be aware of, then we're gonna run into situations where we thought it was a good idea to make a virtual rapper and until we didn't, right? I think it would be very easy to stop that decision before it happened. But I've been in a lot of discussions where people can really run away with themselves.
The train's already moving.
A lot of things, right?
We just, today we just released a whole suite of case studies by all of the collaborators that have been part of our synthetic media. And each one of them speaks directly to this, where they made a decision, they thought it sounded right. It could be about using an image of a deceased individual. It could be about, taking someone's face and changing it, right? And in the moment, there's all sorts of reasons why you make those decisions. And then they have sort of openly interrogated their decision-making process. And we've just posted all of these online, and they're just fascinating stories that speak directly to this. These are challenging questions that need reflection and need to be interrogated.
And
And those
can
are
I
on
say
the
something?
Open AI, the Partnership for AI website, people can
That's
access
right,
those,
yeah.
that's great.
Yeah.
I was
It's a
just
great
gonna say-
resource, by the way, that website.
I was just gonna say, I do think it's important to note that like, we are going to make mistakes as we head into the wide world, an exciting world, and for some people, scary world of AI, right? We're not going to get it perfect. And so I am a big believer in accountability, but I'm not a believer in like punishment and retribution and necessarily, I don't actually believe that cancel culture is
really
real.
important, yeah.
We can have a long conversation about that. I don't know anyone
That's
that has been
next to
meaningfully canceled. However, I do think like Capitol Music could have done a lot of things upon getting the feedback from the audience. One of them would have been stay the course. He's got 10 million followers on TikTok, right? I think it is important to be able to say, you know what? Maybe we don't need to continue with that, right? And I do think that that is something that each of us, both from a corporate perspective and also from a personal perspective, you need to be able to have that moment of saying, you know what? I didn't think this through, I wasn't thinking about that. Thank you for sharing something with me, and I'm gonna do something different. Imagine being in a space where new information could actually change someone's mind.
It's a great point. And I think that point takes us actually interestingly into the next area we're gonna talk about, which is training an AI bot and what kind of material trains an AI bot, and that's about accountability and decision-making and who's turning the knobs and who are the senior people in the room. You know, with the George Carlin case, we sort of know, they said, look, we took all this George Carlin material and put it in the machine, right? And out came this other thing. With the FN Mecca case, we don't really know what trained that rapper, right? We don't know if it was news coverage about, urban Black youth. We don't know if it was other rap songs. We don't know what got put into the machine, right? Rebecca, I'm really curious, you were talking before about transparency. Should AI companies be required to disclose all of the content that they're putting into the bot, and also who's controlling the training with that content? How does that work?
Yeah, we absolutely, no surprise, believe that companies do need to be transparent about both their data sources, their data collection processes, and then the mechanisms that they put into place to filter, clean, and train that data moving forward as well. So, and this is particularly interesting for these generative AI models. So a lot of the AI that we're talking about are what we think of as large language models. And many of these are trained on just vast amounts of data. Like you think about the Library of Congress, right? It holds hundreds of thousands of books. Well, we're talking about millions and trillions of corpus that are collected and crawled from across the internet, as well as combined with proprietary data sets as well, if one of the technology companies like Google or otherwise has their own data set. So I think it is really important. I think we are getting a much better sense about where this data is coming from. And then there are, again, a whole series of measures that are taken once the data is collected that I think are also really important as well. And there's a whole movement around transparency about what those methodologies are, and also who's involved. How diverse are the collection of human raters that are engaged in actually looking at whether this data is correct, is demographically representative, is also truly sourced and identified. And I think at the end of the day, people say with AI, it is all about the data, and it really is, even in these large systems, because the training of the algorithms happens all through what it gets out of the data as well. So this is going to continue to be a big area. And of course, you will have seen, talking about copyright, the New York Times case against OpenAI, right, where they're concerned that their data had been collected into the training data.
OpenAI believes in an open and free internet to train their models, and then they give us their tools for free, right? It's open.
It's not really how that works.
That's interesting.
There's a professional grade one, you have to pay for it.
Yeah,
It's actually better.
interesting, yeah. Kamala, I'm curious, talking about training, what happens when AI is used to generate a script or even a film about underrepresented characters or stories, but none of the people overseeing that AI-generated production are from that particular background, whether it's, a different race, LGBTQ, whatever it might be?
I think that that is a new flavor of an old ice cream, if that makes sense, right? I think that
Entire
like,
music industry.
right? That is not, what you just described, the dynamics of that are not necessarily unusual, but it's just the AI version of that, right? In content, we have often had content that's centered underrepresented communities where not many underrepresented people from those communities were involved in the making of it, right? Was it wrong? Was it problematic then? Probably. Like, did it reflect in the content? Did it lack a certain authenticity? Yes. And so I think the way that I think about it is that the demise and the elimination and the obsolescence of humans in industry has been worried about for generations, and it's never actually happened. I think that like humans are still the best people that you can get to tell a story, act in a story, produce a story, direct a story. Like, that hasn't changed. And I think specifically with respect to underrepresented communities and their representation, authenticity really does win at the box office. Like, especially people from those communities, I know when I see something that just, it might look black, but it doesn't feel black, right? And that doesn't mean that there's one way to be black, but that means that I am aware of all of the different variations of that, and that is none of them, right? And so I do think that, like, you know, if we are truly worried about getting into a space where we are, as an audience, we are consuming a fully AI created entertainment that has no human hands on it, which I do not believe that we're close to, I think that we will be using the same sort of critical and also just internal and emotional litmus tests and filters that will sort of let us know sort of like, do I feel represented? And I think it goes back to something that you mentioned, Rebecca, which is, as we're building this technology, who is building it? There's a quote that says, like, don't just accept its magic, right? There isn't a wizard up in the sky that is, you know, magically creating AI, right? It is rooms of people that either look like this or don't look like this, that are having conversations about what should be ingested, what should be kept out, how much weight should I put on this? And I know we'll talk about the Google Gemini thing, which I can't wait to, because I do think that is another important case of recognizing that, like, who is shaping a thing really does matter, and that is never gonna not matter. And so there is always going to be a case for authentic diversity and inclusion that is always going to be more successful. I think, you know, working in this industry, I follow the inclusion reports that come out in Hollywood every year, probably a little bit closer than some others. And yet again, for record-setting 10 years in a row, inclusive content is good for business. Did you hear? Please tell someone.
But it's all still flat.
Right?
In terms of how much we make.
As far as many people.
Exactly, it's a shocker. Like, audiences respond to films that look like the world that they live in. Every year, it's breaking news, right? But it's gonna continue to be the thing that works, and I don't think that AI is going to be able to cheat its way to creating inclusive content, so that's gonna actually resonate with, like, human beings in the world.
Yeah, I just want to jump on two things there. First, I agree with you, I don't think we're close to AI technology generating original content, screenplays, television shows, those types of things, because I don't believe that any Gen AI lays awake at night worried about their relationship with their parents. I mean, the fallibility of
Not
humans.
sentient, still not sentient, right?
The fallibility of human beings is what makes art, right? It's the air and the vinyl that makes it different from electronic music. The second part of this is I've been involved for 25 years with an organization called the Ghetto Film School, which gives young, diverse audiences, underrepresented communities an opportunity to learn university level film courses. And I am actually very hopeful that Gen AI can level the playing field for young, diverse filmmakers, musicians, because it gives them access to cinematography, gives them access to animation, gives us access to editing
As a
that they
companion
would
and
never ever have the opportunity to get otherwise, unless they somehow magically got greenlit with their film. And in the creator economy, where people are getting more famous and generating more income very often than they can ever within the gatekeeper economy, I think these tools are important advantages for young, especially people who are disadvantaged from an economic standpoint, the opportunity that they can't go to NYU, but they could make a film that gets 100 million views.
That's huge. AI can be democratizing in that way, right? Well, let's go into Google Gemini, which I know everybody is excited to talk about, and I think this comes back to questions of authenticity and who's in control of training these LLMs and bots. The recent Google Gemini gaffe, you guys may have heard about it last month. Google halted their AI tool's ability to generate images because of getting blasted on social media and in the regular media for producing historically inaccurate images that largely showed people of color in place of white people. So for example, when it was prompted by CNN to generate an image of a pope, Gemini produced an image of a man and a woman, neither of whom were white. And when The Verge asked the tool to produce images of people of color, produce images of a 1943 German soldier, it produced people of color in response to that prompt. And so this upset anti-woke folks that the tool was overcompensating for diversity. But on the other hand, OpenAI's DALL-E image generator has taken heat for generating harmful racial and ethnic stereotypes at scale in some of what they've generated. And that's been called out obviously by anti-racists and other proponents of inclusivity. So both of these embarrassing gaffes really point to how challenging it is for AI tools to get the concept of race and gender and other demographics figured out when they generate these things. I'm going to open it up to the panel. I know everybody kind of wants to speak on this. So Kamala, do you want to start? We'll kind of work around it. Yeah.
Sure. So I think this is a fascinating example. And a lot of the reactions that I've seen to it do kind of make me chuckle a little bit. Because I think that there's a way in which everyone, including Google, can say pretty instantly, we should be historically accurate, right? There are so many ways for you to know and find out what German soldiers look like, that I'm not so sure why that would have been your first stop, but okay. If you're like, show me the American founders, like, I think you know who they are. Right? Right? I mean, by America. Right? But I think that it is important to talk about this example because a lot of what is missed from the critique is the explanation of like, why was Google endeavoring to do this in the first place? Again, we can't pretend that the internet arrived today. And oh my gosh, how dare you, right? Google had released a photo product that at its inception identified Black people when photographed as gorillas. Right? Google still today, when you do image searches, if you are not specific about Black businessmen, if you just search corporate businessmen, you're going to get disproportionately white photos. If you search for a CEO, you're going to have to scroll quite a bit before you get women. Right? I think that it is important to understand what is the environment in which they realized we have not been doing this, we need to actually put a thumb on the scale. And I think that while putting a thumb on the scale makes people uncomfortable, it has been happening at scale since the creation of tech. This is the arrival of sort of a different set of concerns getting brought into the thumb on scale and like not being nailed in its first entry. But I am not that excited to participate in conversations that pretend that history never happened and one day we woke up and this is what we saw.
Yeah, I mean, oh my God, there was all this Sturm and Drang around this. And first of all, I'm not sure what's wrong with Black Pope. But second of all, go back to the first tech of the printing press, right? Misinformation and mistaken information. Starting in my historical lineage, the elders of Zion, misleading people into thinking that Jews control the banks, which we do, but we don't really let people know it. But the key here is like, again, I think it does boil down to who's asking the question, because Gemini didn't issue the images, the prompts did, Verge, CNN. Why was Verge going to Gemini
for the
for a
purpose
picture of a Nazi? There's a lot
I
of
think they were
pictures.
testing it, right? They were trying to see, like, can we catch it up, right? Can we get it in a mistake,
Well, then
right?
and then the question is, how did Gemini, the creators of Gemini and Google, not catch it first?
Right.
That's right.
Like, that's an easy fucking catch, man. And so, why? How did they not just test it out 6 or 7 times before? Like, I put out a lot of data, I put out a lot of images on a regular basis. I run it through a pretty stringent set of, is this bullshit, before I put it out there, because I don't want someone catching me at mistake. I'm not sure what a data mistake as big as a black Nazi looks like, but I'm sure I'll find out someday. The key is, again, I think it goes back to critical thinking and the idea that, do your fucking homework. You're right, Verge was testing out the boundaries of this, but how did one of the 4 largest companies in the history of the world,
You would think that would be
catch it
part of our
first?
QA engineer's checklist, right? Like,
Can we see white people?
So, I mean, I think you're all getting a much better understanding of just how flawed these systems really are and how much even these large companies don't necessarily know what they are going to produce. And this has been some of what we've been hearing, right? Like, we have to release these models because until we release them in the wild, we won't know actually how they
I
behave.
think there's another incentive for them to release them in the wild before they're ready, which is entirely around their stock price. Google has been hurt by their inability to be ahead on AI, and it has hurt their stock price. Other companies, during their earnings report, when they don't have the right answer around AI, their stock drops. In fact, Google stock dropped a lot after the Gemini thing, 5% almost that week.
Yeah.
So I think the incentives, again, are really imbalanced, and that's one of the reasons why they rush these things to market before they're ready.
Yeah, I think yes, absolutely. There are business incentives as well, and I think that the challenge is these models, how they're not created to be factually accurate in the first instance. They're models that are created to have the capacity to create video, to create imagery, to now create text. But they are not a Google search where you go and you get a series of links that take you to accurate sources, and you, as the prompter or the viewer, can make a choice about, do I trust that source? What these do is they take all the data and then they produce. And this is what they're focusing on right now, is this imbalance between what are called hallucinations, and which is that the models will just come up with some really outlandish images or phrases. And before they had put some of the protections into place, I used to tell people that the best thing to do was to put into a prompt your own bio, because what would come back would be what looks like a perfectly appropriate set of universities and experiences, but none of them were accurate, because it wasn't that the model was giving you facts and evidence. It was just predicting where you could have gone to school and where you could have
and what
lived.
you wanted to hear or see, right?
Right. So I mean, this is the challenge with this particular type of AI that's not narrowly focused on a very specific prediction, where we've also seen challenges, but is really focused on generating this new content, this new text, and this new imagery. And you're absolutely right. This comes together with the movement in tech, which has been about how do we make these systems less biased and less discriminatory, and what happened is what we saw.
Well, and I think what you're saying, Evan, is that these tech companies are so absorbed in their own irrational exuberance and desire to be first to market and get that stock bump that they're not taking social or moral responsibility or even legal responsibility.
There was a day that when the first question that was always asked is what human problem are we looking to solve? Google, great product, right? What Facebook, connecting the world together, across geography. So there was always a time where these companies were first and foremost driven by mission driven. What human problem are we looking to solve? Now the problem that most of these companies are looking to solve is what they're going to say in their next earnings call. Period.
That's right. And that's the case for media companies as well, which will lead us to our last question. I know we're running out of time. We obviously, there have been a couple panels on it here. We're hearing from media's obit that peak TV is dead, the theatrical film business is struggling since pre-pandemic. In the wake of subscription streaming not, generating the revenue that these companies need, they're all belt tightening and making less content, maybe more broadly appealing for quadrant content. Part of AI's appeal for these studios is the possibility of saving money, right? And the possibility of getting around expensive talent or being able to, shortcut. And let's not kid ourselves, AI is being used in post-production and in animation, lots of tools already by big studios and by individual creators, as you mentioned, Evan. But the idea that AI could generate an entire movie is something that takes it to another level, especially at the same time that maybe we're seeing a defunding of some of the DEI programs that bring these authentic voices into the system. I'll start with you, Evan. Is this a doomsday moment for inclusive stories and characters? Like, how do we kind of figure out what's next, or maybe for the entire entertainment industry? Where are we?
Oh my goodness, it's a whole other
Just a
thing.
small.
So, we are in a doomsday moment, not just for media, traditional media, but for big tech as well. Look at Apple's performance so far this year. And a big part of it is we've stopped innovating around human need, and we've only started innovating. These big companies are traditionally or primarily innovating around their own financial need. And that's when you lose the thread. This is not a new story. This happens. You get to be a very successful company based on one great idea that really did solve a lot of human problems, and then you peak and you run out of ideas, and it's really just about the balance sheet from that point forward. So that is the critical moment that we are in big tech and big media. But you look at what's happening on, last week there was a speech given by our president, and there was a response afterwards, and that response was debunked by some TikToker. Not by mainstream media, not by a big organization well funded, but by some guy in his basement on Google, right? And so I do think we are in a magic moment here where the creator-led community, what I like to call a community economy, is going to wind up, I think, being the most important part of the content ecosystem. That the most important stories, the most diverse stories, the most inclusive stories, the most representative stories, the most inventive stories are going to come from artists themselves using new technology to empower themselves to get level footing with, Madam Web. Not run by AI, but a terrible piece of content. And so people can make shit too. So the key here is I do think if you want to see where the future of media is headed, with all due respect to the studio system, and I think you're doing amazing work there, I think there will be, and there were great films represented at the Oscars, including American Fiction, where a young black man won for Best Adapted Screenplay against the monolith that was Oppenheimer for American Fiction.
And he makes this point in his acceptance speech.
Yeah, he did. He said, we're all here. We're sitting here waiting to be hired. Here we are. Come get us. But my answer very often to those young black and brown and yellow and diverse artists is, do not wait for the green light. Greenlight yourself. There have never been better tools to compete with the studio system, and the studio system is limping. They are vulnerable. They are in danger. A lot of them won't be here in 5 years, but you will be. And you have an opportunity to take the power into your own hands. So to me, I am focused on that more than half. The creator economy is going to be a $500 billion business before the end of this decade. It's already a $250 billion business, right? So there's money out there to be made. There's opportunity out there to be made. There are audiences out there to reach. There are stories that you need to tell. Do not sit around waiting for the Disneys and the Foxes and the studio system to greenlight you. You have the opportunity to greenlight yourself.
Sure. I'll say a couple things. I think with respect to doomsday, and this is going to sound very anti-capitalist, and I'm not, but I would like to put it into perspective that, I don't know that I can call a version of, not going from 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion being, the end of your life, right? Oh my gosh, what a doomsday, right? I think we have to sort of put it into context. We have become accustomed to an extremely aggressive level of growth year over year over year.
Which is not realistic.
That was probably never going to be sustainable, and I don't know that the slowing of that growth and the associated income inequality that has come from that growth is necessarily immediately something to say this is a doomsday. Secondly, I do think that as we're thinking about creativity and how AI will intersect with it, and how it intersects with DEI, I think that it's really important to remember that technology has always been an assistive tool to creative minds. AI is another technology tool that I think will be an assistive tool to creative minds. It will be an incredibly important tool to business minds too, and without it, you will likely be left behind. But I don't think that that means that all of a sudden there isn't going to be a place for innovative, interesting stories that can only be come by through lived experience. As we saw with the FN Mecca rapper, that it turns out you can't actually program and create a Black person of your own, right? I am a Black person for a lot of different reasons, right? I have a lifetime of lived experiences and things that happen to me on a daily basis that informs the perspective that I'm able to bring to the table at my workplace. And I think that's true for every creative person, and that's true for every creative executive in the space. And being aware of sort of how AI and technology generally can help you be better at the things that you are meant to do, can help you be more innovative, can help you use different skills that maybe you haven't been using because you've been doing things that are a little monotonous, and now you can do things that are a little bit sort of more creative and free thinking. I do think that that is the future. I think the future of inclusive content will be much more quickly impacted by who our C-suite is and how they decide to make decisions than it will be impacted by AI.
Thank you to this panel. You guys were amazing. I